Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. Before the waters of the great flood washed the world clean, before Noah built his ark of gopher wood and pitch, before the rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights, there lived upon the earth a race of beings that should never have existed. They were the Nephilim, the giants of old, the men of renown spoken of in hushed whispers throughout the ancient world. But their story does not begin with them. It begins in the highest vaults of heaven, in the time before time, when 200 angels looked down upon the daughters of men and made a choice that would shake the very foundations of creation. This is a story found in fragments and shadows, in texts that religious authorities have sometimes embraced and sometimes condemned. It appears in the 6th chapter of Genesis, in just 4 cryptic verses, but unfolds across hundreds of pages in books that most people have never read. The Book of Enoch, preserved for millennia by Ethiopian Christians. The Book of Jubilees, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Book of Giants, pieced together from ancient fragments. Tonight, we will walk through these forgotten scriptures and recover a narrative so powerful, so disturbing, that it has haunted human consciousness for over 3,000 years. Please take a moment to support with a like and subscription if you haven't already. It's how I know this content is worthwhile. Thank you sincerely. And because I value our community connections, I'd enjoy hearing where everyone's watching from and what time it is there. Let your awareness soften and blur as ancient echoes guide us to the summit of Mount Hermon, where the dew of heaven meets the dust of earth, where the boundary between the celestial and terrestrial grows gossamer thin, and where 200 beings of light prepare to make a covenant that will darken the world. The vigil before time. In the days before the descent, before corruption touched the pristine earth, the cosmos operated according to divine order. The watchers, known in the angelic tongue as the Grigori, maintained their posts in the 5th heaven, that celestial realm where the movements of stars were ordained and the courses of the sun and moon were set in motion. Their duty was observation, their purpose was vigilance, their nature was to witness without intervention. These were not the seraphim who burned with 6 wings around the throne of the Most High, nor were they the cherubim whose 4 faces gazed in all directions. The watchers occupied a middle realm in the celestial hierarchy, close enough to Earth to observe its workings, elevated enough to understand the cosmic patterns that governed its seasons and cycles. They watched as Adam was formed from clay and given the breath of life. They observed as Eve emerged from Adam's rib in the Garden of Paradise. They witnessed the first sin, the first murder, the first cities rising from the dust. For untold ages, they maintained their vigil with perfect discipline. Each watcher had his station and his purpose. Semyaza, whose name meant he sees the name, led their ranks with wisdom and authority. Azazel, the strong one of God, understood the deep mysteries of creation, the properties of metal and stone, the ways that matter could be shaped and transformed. Kokabeel commanded 21 subordinates and traced the pathways of stars across the celestial sphere. Penuel guarded the secrets of the written word, understanding that knowledge, once recorded, could never truly be destroyed. In their original state, these beings existed in a form of consciousness we can barely comprehend. They perceived reality not through physical senses, but through direct apprehension of truth. They saw not just the surface of things, but their essential nature, their purpose in the grand design. When they observed humanity, they saw souls wrapped in flesh, spirits learning the hard lessons of material existence. They watched humans struggle, love, create, and die, all according to the mysterious plan that even angels could not fully fathom. The heavenly realm where they dwelt was a place of perpetual light, but not the harsh light that burns and blinds. This was the light of understanding, of perfect knowledge, of absolute clarity. There was no deception there, no shadow in which to hide impure thoughts. Every intention was transparent, every motivation clear. The watchers moved in harmony, their individual wills aligned with the divine purpose, like instruments in a cosmic symphony. Yet something began to change. As they watched the daughters of men walking in the valleys of the earth, adorning themselves with flowers, singing by the rivers, dancing in the moonlight. A new sensation stirred within these celestial observers. It was not merely appreciation of beauty, for they had beheld the glory of the divine throne. It was something more personal, more urgent, more dangerous. It was desire. Mount Hermon, the terrible oath. You stand among them now, these beings of light who have taken on the semblance of flesh. Feel the solidity of the mountain beneath your feet. Mount Hermon, the highest peak in the ancient lands of Canaan. The air here is thin and cold, carrying the scent of snow even in summer. Below you, the world spreads out in a tapestry of green valleys and silver streams, smoke rising from the hearth fires of human settlements. But your attention is drawn to your companions, these 200 who have descended from their celestial posts. Your leader, Semyaza, stands at the center of your gathering. In his true form, he would blind mortal eyes. But here he appears as a man of impossible beauty, tall and powerful, with eyes that hold the depth of eternity. Yet those eyes now carry something they never held before. Doubt, he speaks, and his voice resonates not just in your ears but in your very essence. My brothers, he says, and you feel the weight of his words. We stand at the threshold of an action from which there is no return. I fear that I alone will bear the punishment for this sin we contemplate. You feel the murmur ripple through your ranks. Each of you has seen them, the daughters of men, and each has felt the pull of desire that has drawn you from your heavenly station to this mountain peak. The women move through their daily lives, unaware of the cosmic drama unfolding above them, unaware that beings who helped sing creation into existence now plot to abandon their posts for the warmth of mortal embrace. Your hand moves with the others as the oath is prepared. The words are spoken in the language of heaven, each syllable carrying the weight of cosmic law. You bind yourself not just to the action but to your brothers, swearing that all will share in the punishment, that none will abandon the others to face judgment alone. As you speak the words, you feel something fundamental within you shift. The light that has always filled you dims slightly. The connection to the celestial realm, while not severed, becomes strained, like a rope pulled too tight. We bind ourselves with mutual curses, you declare together. We will not turn back from this plan until we have accomplished it. The mountain itself seems to tremble at your words. This place will forever be marked by what has happened here. Future generations will call it Mount Hermon, from the Hebrew word herem, meaning cursed or devoted to destruction. The very stones beneath your feet have become witnesses to the most terrible rebellion since the morning star fell from heaven. You feel your form solidifying, becoming more substantial, more material. The ethereal body you have worn for eons takes on weight and density. You experience, for the first time, the sensation of a heartbeat, the need to breathe, the strange vulnerability of flesh. Your wings, those appendages of light that carried you through the celestial spheres, fold into your back and disappear. You are still more than human, still possessed of knowledge and power beyond mortal comprehension, but you are no longer purely spirit. As your transformation completes, new sensations flood through you. Hunger, not for food but for experience. Thirst, not for water, but for the unknown pleasures of physical existence. And desire, no longer abstract but urgent and specific, pulling you toward the valleys below where the daughters of men go about their evening tasks, unaware that their beauty has caused heaven itself to fall. The book that heaven forgot. The record of these events might have been lost forever, scattered like dust across the millennia, were it not for a single figure who walked between the worlds. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, who lived 365 years before God took him. But we run ahead of our story. First, we must understand how this cosmic drama came to be preserved in texts that would survive flood, fire, and the deliberate suppression of religious authorities for over 2,000 years. The Book of Enoch, or more properly, First Enoch, exists today primarily because of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which alone among Christian traditions accepted it as canonical scripture. For centuries, European scholars knew of its existence only through brief references in the New Testament and early church fathers. Jude quotes it directly, saying, "Behold, The Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints, to execute judgment upon all. Tertullian defended its authenticity. Origen referred to it with respect, yet by the 4th century, most Christian authorities had rejected it, perhaps disturbed by its elaborate angelology, its detailed descriptions of heaven and hell, or its unflinching account of angels who chose to fall. The book itself claims to be written by Enoch, that enigmatic figure who appears in Genesis for only a few verses. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. But scholars recognize in its pages the hands of multiple authors, writing across several centuries before Christ. The oldest sections, including the story of the Watchers, likely date to the 3rd century before Christ, though they preserve traditions that are far older. In 1773, the Scottish explorer James Bruce returned from Ethiopia, carrying 3 copies of this lost book. Europe's biblical scholars could hardly believe what they were reading. Here was an elaborate expansion of those cryptic verses in Genesis 6, providing names, motivations, and consequences for the sons of God, who saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. Here were detailed accounts of Enoch's journeys through the heavens, his visions of judgment, his role as intermediary between the fallen watchers and the divine court. But Ethiopia was not the only keeper of these secrets. In 1947, Bedouin shepherds searching for a lost goat near the Dead Sea discovered clay jars in a cave containing ancient scrolls. Among the texts that would revolutionize biblical scholarship were multiple fragments of the Book of Enoch in Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke. These fragments, dating to the 2nd century before Christ, proved that the Ethiopian version had preserved, with remarkable accuracy, a text that was already ancient when the Dead Sea Scrolls were written. The Qumran community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls was obsessed with the Watchers. They saw, in this ancient story, a template for understanding their own time, when they believed the forces of light and darkness were preparing for a final battle. They copied and recopied the Enochic texts, adding their own interpretations and expansions. They wrote of the giants in texts scholars now call the Book of Giants, fragments of which have been found not only at Qumran, but in Manichaean texts discovered in Central Asia, showing how widely these stories spread across the ancient world. What these texts preserve is nothing less than an alternative history of evil's entry into the world. While the canonical Bible focuses on human sin in the Garden of Eden, the Enochic tradition presents a cosmic rebellion that corrupted not just humanity, but the very fabric of creation. The knowledge that the Watchers brought to earth was not merely practical but transformative, introducing arts and sciences that humans were never meant to possess. At least not yet, not without the wisdom to use them properly. The preservation of these texts is itself a kind of miracle. They survived the burning of libraries, the suppression of heretical works, the decay of papyrus and parchment. They were hidden in Ethiopian monasteries, in caves by the Dead Sea, in the memories of communities that refused to forget. Today, scholars pore over every word, every variant reading, trying to reconstruct not just the original text, but the worldview of those who found in the story of the Watchers an explanation for the presence of evil in a world created by a good God. 200 stars falling. The descent was not chaotic but ordered, not a mob but an army, maintaining its ranks. Even in rebellion, 200 Watchers followed Semyaza down from their celestial posts, and the ancient texts preserve many of their names, each one revealing something about their nature and the specific corruption they would bring to earth. After Semyaza, the leader who bore responsibility for all that would follow, came Azazel, whose name has been interpreted as scapegoat or strength of God. He would become, in many traditions, the most notorious of the fallen Watchers, the teacher of warfare and cosmetics, the one whom the Book of Enoch singles out for special condemnation. The whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin. Then came Kokabeel, whose name means Star of God, the angel who understood the secret paths of celestial bodies. Tamiel taught the knowledge of spirits. Ramiel commanded thunder. Daniel understood the signs of the Sunday. Ezekiel knew the clouds and their portents. Barachel revealed astrology. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments. Shamsiel, whose name meant son of God, revealed the signs of the heavenly lights. Sariel taught the course of the moon, essential knowledge for those who would practice the forbidden arts under cover of darkness. Each name represents not just an individual, but a category of forbidden knowledge that would be released into the world. The ancient writers who preserved these names understood that knowledge itself could be a form of corruption when given without wisdom, power without responsibility, capability without moral development. The Watchers did not merely take human wives. They brought to humanity a technological and magical revolution that the earth was not prepared to receive. Consider Penemuel, the one who taught humanity to write with ink and paper. On the surface, this seems benign, even beneficial. But the text tells us that through writing, many sinned from eternity to eternity, and until this day. For men were not created for such a purpose, to confirm their good faith with pen and ink. The written word, in this tradition, was meant to be a divine prerogative, not a human tool. Once humans could record their thoughts, their lies, their blasphemies, these became permanent, spreading far beyond their original context. Gadriel was identified in some traditions as the serpent who led Eve astray, though in the Watcher narrative, his crime was teaching humanity the blows of death, the arts of killing that went far beyond the simple murder of Abel by Cain. He revealed the systematic methods of warfare, the creation of weapons, the organization of violence that would lead to the wars that would characterize human history ever after. The number 200 itself carries significance. In the mystical mathematics of the ancient world, it represented completeness in rebellion, a full contingent choosing to abandon their posts. Some traditions suggest that these 200 were leaders of larger groups, that the total number of fallen angels was far greater, but 200 is the number that took the oath on Mount Hermon, the number that bound themselves with mutual curses, the number whose names were recorded in the books of heaven as traitors to the divine order. As they descended, these beings retained much of their angelic knowledge and power. They were not immediately stripped of their abilities, but rather chose to use them for purposes never intended. They could still perceive the fundamental structures of reality, still manipulate matter and energy in ways that would seem miraculous to human observers. But now these abilities were directed not toward maintaining cosmic order, but toward impressing and seducing the daughters of men, toward establishing themselves as gods in a world that had known only one God. When angels walked as men. The world into which the Watchers descended was not the world we know. This was the age before the flood, when the descendants of Adam still lived for centuries, when the memory of paradise had not yet faded completely from human consciousness, when the boundary between the natural and supernatural remained permeable. In those days, the earth itself was different. The texts speak of a time when a mist rose from the ground to water the plants, when the violence that would later characterize human existence was still a fresh wound on creation's innocence. Cain had murdered Abel, yes, and Cain's descendants had built the first cities, but humanity had not yet reached the total corruption that would eventually call down the waters of judgment. Into this world came beings of impossible beauty and terrible knowledge. They did not appear as monsters or demons, but as the most beautiful of men, taller than any human, with faces that seemed to capture light itself. When they walked through human settlements, all activity ceased. When they spoke, their voices carried an authority that bypassed human reason and spoke directly to the soul. The daughters of men who attracted their attention were not ordinary women, but those whom the texts describe as beautiful, though beauty in that primordial age meant something more than mere physical appearance. These were women who carried within them a special vitality, a connection to the creative forces of the earth. Some traditions suggest they were the daughters of Seth, the righteous line, while the sons of God were the descendants of Cain. But the more ancient interpretation, the one that haunted the dreams of apocalyptic writers, was that these were true angels, beings from another order of creation entirely. The seduction was not crude or violent. The Watchers courted the women with displays of power and knowledge. They revealed secrets of heaven, showed visions of other worlds, demonstrated abilities that violated the laws of nature as humans understood them. They offered not just themselves but transformation, the chance to bear children who would be greater than ordinary humans, to become the mothers of a new race that would combine heavenly power with earthly passion. The teaching of forbidden arts. The knowledge that the Watchers brought to humanity was comprehensive and systematic, covering every aspect of what we would now call technology and occult science. Each Watcher taught according to his particular expertise, and humans proved to be eager students, hungry for power and advancement. Azazel's teachings were perhaps the most immediately destructive. He taught men to make swords and knives, shields and breastplates, introducing not just the tools of war, but the concept of organized warfare itself. Before his instruction, violence had been personal, limited, driven by passion or necessity. After his teaching, war became an art, a science, a profession. He showed men how to work metals, to extract them from the earth, and forge them in fires hot enough to transform stone into implements of death. But Azazel's instruction went beyond warfare. To women, he taught the art of beautification, the use of antimony to darken the eyes, the precious stones that could adorn the body, the dyes that could change the color of fabric. These might seem like innocent crafts, but the texts present them as corruptions, ways of enhancing physical beauty to inspire lust, techniques of deception that allowed the outer appearance to mask the inner reality. Through cosmetics and jewelry, humanity learned to present itself as something other than what it was. Semyaza taught enchantments and root cutting, the magical arts that would later be called witchcraft. These were not simple herbal remedies, but ways of manipulating the invisible forces that governed health, fertility, and fortune. Plants that had been created as food or medicine were revealed to have other properties when cut at certain times, prepared with specific incantations, combined with ritual actions. The natural world became a pharmacy of power for those who knew its secrets. Kokabeel revealed the mysteries of the stars, not just their movements but their influences on earthly events. This was more than astronomy. It was astrology in its most potent form, the understanding that celestial bodies were not merely lights in the sky, but forces that shaped human destiny. Through his teaching, humans learned to read the future in stellar configurations, to time their actions according to cosmic rhythms, to believe they could manipulate fate itself through knowledge of heavenly patterns. Barakiel taught the readers of signs, those who could interpret omens in the flight of birds, the patterns of clouds, the entrails of sacrificed animals. Every random event became potentially meaningful, every natural phenomenon a possible message from invisible powers. This knowledge transformed humans from beings who lived in the present to creatures constantly anxious about the future, seeking signs and portents in every shadow. Penemuel's gift of writing revolutionized human consciousness. Before writing, knowledge was limited to what could be remembered and transmitted orally. Wisdom died with the wise, and each generation had to rediscover truths that had been found before. With writing, knowledge became cumulative, but more dangerously, lies could be preserved as easily as truth. Blasphemies could spread beyond the voice of the blasphemer. Contracts could bind people to agreements they no longer remembered making. The written word became a kind of magic in itself, fixing reality in permanent form. The medical knowledge taught by the Watchers went beyond healing, to include ways of causing harm that would appear natural. They revealed poisons that could kill without trace, diseases that could be transmitted deliberately, ways of manipulating the human body that could cause suffering or pleasure, according to the will of the practitioner. Medicine became a double-edged sword, capable of preserving life or ending it with equal efficiency. All of these arts had one thing in common. They gave humans power that exceeded their wisdom to use it properly. The Watchers did not teach gradually, allowing humanity to develop the moral and spiritual capacity to handle such knowledge responsibly. They dumped the secrets of heaven onto earth all at once, like giving weapons to children or fire to those who had lived always in darkness. The result was not enlightenment but chaos, not advancement but corruption. Azazel's gift of war. In the time before Azazel's teaching, when men fought, they used stones picked up from the ground, wooden clubs carved from fallen branches, perhaps spears with points hardened in fire. Death came, when it came from passion or desperation, and often the fighters would exhaust themselves before fatal blows were struck. Azazel changed everything with a single revelation, the secret of iron. He led his students to places where rusty stones lay on the earth's surface, teaching them to recognize the ore that held within it the potential for transformation. He showed them how to build furnaces that could reach temperatures no cooking fire had ever achieved, how to feed the flames with constant air through bellows made from animal skins. In the cherry-red glow of heated metal, humanity glimpsed for the first time its capacity to reshape the very substance of creation. The first sword that emerged from Azazel's forge was more than a weapon. It was a statement of rebellion against the natural order. Its edge could cut through flesh and bone, as easily as a hand passes through water. Its point could pierce the toughest hide, reach the vital organs protected by ribs and muscle. In the hands of one who knew its use, it multiplied human strength beyond all previous imagining. But Azazel taught more than metallurgy. He revealed the arts of strategy and tactics, the ways that smaller forces could defeat larger ones through superior positioning and timing. He introduced the concept of armies, of men trained to fight in formation, to subordinate their individual will to a commander's vision. War became not an eruption of chaos but an imposition of order, terrible in its efficiency. Under his tutelage, humans learned to read terrain with a warrior's eye, to see where ambushes could be laid, where defensive positions could be established, how rivers and mountains could be used as weapons in themselves. They learned the psychological aspects of warfare, how fear could be a weapon as powerful as any sword, how the display of cruelty to some could break the will of many. The women of that time were not exempt from Azazel's influence. To them, he taught different arts of war, the ways that beauty could be weaponized, that desire could be used to destroy. The cosmetics he revealed were not mere vanity but tools of manipulation, ways to awaken lust that could lead men to betray their brothers, their oaths, their gods. The jewelry he taught them to make and wear became symbols of status that divided humanity into classes, creating envy and competition where there had been community. The daughters of Cain. Not all the women who became wives to the Watchers were passive victims of celestial seduction. The texts hint at a more complex reality, one where human women actively participated in the cosmic rebellion, where the daughters of men possessed their own agency and ambition in the union with the sons of heaven. These women, identified in some traditions as the descendants of Cain, carried within their bloodline the memory of the first murder, the first city, the first technologies of human invention. Cain had been marked by God, protected from vengeance, but exiled from divine presence. His descendants had learned to live without direct divine guidance, to create their own culture, their own meaning, their own power structures. When the Watchers appeared among them, these women recognized opportunity. Here were beings who possessed knowledge that could elevate humanity beyond its earthbound limitations. The texts describe how the women adorned themselves to attract the Watchers' attention, how they performed rituals by the water, how they displayed their beauty under the stars, where the celestial beings could observe them. One tradition speaks of a woman named Ishtar, not the goddess, but a human woman of surpassing beauty and intelligence, who became the wife of Semyaza himself. She did not cower before his celestial nature, but questioned him, learned from him, perhaps even taught him things about earthly existence that he, in all his heavenly wisdom, had never understood. Through her, Semyaza experienced not just physical pleasure, but emotional complexity, the mixture of joy and sorrow, hope and fear that characterized human existence. Another was Naamah, sister of Tubal-Cain, described in Genesis as one who worked in bronze and iron. She became consort to Azazel, and together they advanced the arts of metallurgy beyond what either human or angel could have achieved alone. She understood the earthly properties of metals, while he knew their celestial correspondences, and their collaboration produced weapons and tools of unprecedented power. These women paid a terrible price for their ambition. To bear the children of angels was to carry offspring whose very nature violated the boundaries of creation. The pregnancies were difficult, extending far beyond the normal 9 months. The women's bodies were transformed by the celestial seed growing within them, becoming something more than human but less than divine. Some traditions say they gained extended lifespans, living for centuries while remaining young, but at the cost of becoming increasingly isolated from purely human community. They became the first witches, the first women to wield supernatural power in their own right. The knowledge their angelic husbands shared with them was passed on to their daughters, creating lineages of women who understood the secret properties of herbs, the power of spoken words, the ways to call upon invisible forces. Long after the Watchers were imprisoned and the Nephilim destroyed, these arts persisted, hidden but never entirely forgotten, preserved in whispered traditions that would surface throughout history in the figures of sibyls, priestesses, and wise women. Yet the texts also preserve a note of tragedy in their stories. These women had traded their humanity for power, their mortality for a kind of cursed immortality. They would live to see their giant children become monsters, their angelic husbands imprisoned in darkness, the world they had known washed away in the flood. Some traditions say they became the sirens and succubi of later mythology, neither fully human nor entirely spiritual, forever seeking what they had lost in their ambitious reach for heaven. Seeds of giants. As twilight descended over the ancient world, in hidden groves and secret valleys, the unions between the Watchers and human women were consummated. The very air grew heavy with transgression, as if creation itself recognized that boundaries fundamental to its structure were being violated. The moment of conception was unlike anything in the natural order. When angelic essence merged with human flesh, the resulting spark of life burned too bright for mortal wombs to easily contain. The women who carried these hybrid children reported dreams of flying through stars, of seeing the architecture of reality laid bare, of understanding for brief moments the mathematical harmonies that held the universe together. But with the visions came pain, as their bodies struggled to accommodate offspring that belonged fully to neither heaven nor earth. In the joining of these two orders of being, something unprecedented entered the world. The seed of the Watchers carried within it the power of those who had helped sing creation into existence, who had witnessed the separation of light from darkness, who knew the true names of all things. But this seed was now planted in earthly soil, in women who knew hunger and thirst, joy and sorrow, birth and death. The combination produced offspring that would embody the contradictions of their origin, mighty in power but slave to appetite, beautiful in form but terrible in nature, capable of great works but driven by insatiable needs. The earth itself responded to these unnatural conceptions. Where the women walked, plants grew wild and strange. Animals fled or followed them with unusual devotion. Water sources near their dwellings ran sweet or bitter, according to incomprehensible patterns. The boundary between the physical and spiritual became permeable in their presence, as if their pregnancies were gradually unraveling the careful separations that had been established in the first days of creation. Some of the women gloried in their transformation, feeling the power of their unborn children flowing through them like wine. Others grew afraid as they felt their humanity slipping away, replaced by something grand and terrible. All of them knew that there would be no returning to what they had been before. They had become living bridges between realms that were never meant to touch, and the weight of that transgression would mark them and their descendants forever. When the earth bore monsters. The births of the Nephilim did not happen all at once, but spread across decades, each one an event that shook the natural order. The first signs came when the pregnant women began to show after only weeks what should have taken months to develop. Their bellies swelled beyond normal proportion, and those who attended them reported hearing multiple heartbeats, feeling movement that seemed too strong, too purposeful for unborn infants. When labour finally came, It lasted for days. The midwives, who had delivered countless human babies, found themselves confronting something entirely outside their experience. The newborns emerged larger than toddlers, their eyes already open and aware, their bodies perfectly formed but wrong, in proportions that the mind struggled to accept. Some were born with teeth, others with hair that reached to their shoulders, still others with hands that could grip with adult strength from the moment of birth. The Book of Enoch preserves specific measurements that strain credibility, yet were repeated across multiple ancient sources. 3,000 ells in height. If we take an ell as roughly 18 inches, this would make them 4,500 feet tall, clearly impossible by any biological standard. Yet even if we assume textual corruption or symbolic exaggeration, reducing the number by a factor of 100 still gives us giants of 45 feet, beings whose very existence would reshape the world around them. More reasonable interpretations suggest the Nephilim began at relatively human scales, but grew rapidly and continuously. Within a year, they stood taller than grown men. By adolescence, they towered over buildings. Their growth seemed limited only by the resources available to sustain them, and their appetite for those resources proved catastrophic. Is less than #0. 5# is greater than. The texts describe various types among the Nephilim, as if the different watchers produced offspring with distinct characteristics. The children of Semyaza were called the Rephaim, the terrible ones, known for their strength and violence. Azazel's offspring were the Zamzumim, the ones who created a great buzzing or humming sound when they moved, perhaps from the resonance of their massive bodies. The Anakim, descended from Abba, were noted for their long necks and enormous height, becoming the giants that would later terrify the Israelite spies in the land of Canaan. But physical size was only the beginning of what made the Nephilim monstrous. They possessed a hybrid consciousness, able to perceive both the spiritual and material realms simultaneously. They could see the invisible forces that moved through the world, the angels that still maintained their watch, the demons that were beginning to multiply. This dual vision drove many of them to madness, unable to fully exist in either realm, forever torn between their celestial heritage and their earthly nature. Their intelligence developed as rapidly as their bodies. They could speak from birth, not babbling like human infants, but forming complete sentences in languages their mothers had never heard. They understood mathematics intuitively, grasping in moments concepts that human philosophers would struggle with for lifetimes. They could predict weather patterns, understand the properties of materials at a glance, compose music that could induce specific emotional states in listeners. Yet for all their gifts, the Nephilim were fundamentally flawed beings. They inherited from their fathers the knowledge of divine order, but from their mothers, the capacity for chaos. They understood good and evil as abstract concepts, but felt no inner compulsion toward either. They were powerful enough to take whatever they wanted and intelligent enough to justify any action with sophisticated reasoning. In them, might and intellect combined without wisdom or compassion to create beings of perfect selfishness. The human communities near where the Nephilim were born initially tried to accommodate them, perhaps out of fear, perhaps from awe at their abilities. Temples were built to house them, for normal dwellings could not contain their bulk. Special furniture was crafted, tools scaled to their massive hands. But it quickly became apparent that coexistence was impossible. The Nephilim consumed resources at a rate that no community could sustain. A single giant required the food that could feed 100 humans. Their footsteps destroyed crops, their movements toppled buildings, their very presence warped the social fabric of human society. As they matured, the Nephilim began to organize themselves, recognizing their superiority over humanity and their difference from their angelic fathers. They established their own settlements, massive structures built from stones that no human could move. These cities of giants became centers of a new and terrible civilization, one that viewed humanity not as kin, but as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be removed. The names of their cities have come down through mythology. Bashan, where King Og would later rule from his iron bed, 9 cubits long. Gath, where Goliath's family would make their home, Sodom and Gomorrah, which some traditions claim were originally Nephilim settlements before being inhabited by humans who adopted their practices. These were not just large human cities, but places built to an entirely different scale, where doorways stood 30 feet high and streets were wide enough for beings whose single stride covered what humans would need 10 steps to cross. 3,000 ells of terror. You stand in the valley, a human among humans, when the ground begins to shake. At first, you think it might be an earthquake, but the rhythm is too regular, too purposeful. Boom, boom, boom. Like the heartbeat of the earth itself. If the earth's heart were made of stone and hatred, the birds have gone silent, the dogs cower and whine. Even the wind seems to hold its breath. Then you see him cresting the hill, and your mind struggles to process what your eyes report. This is one of the Nephilim, though which one matters little when you stand in his shadow. His head rises above the tallest trees, and when he walks, branches snap like twigs beneath his feet. The sun behind him creates a moving eclipse, plunging the valley into premature twilight with each stride. You want to run, but your legs have become water. You want to scream, but your throat has closed. This is not ordinary fear, but something deeper, more primal, the recognition that you stand before something that should not exist, something that violates the very order of creation. His skin has an unusual quality, seeming to shift between solid flesh and something more ethereal, as if he exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and your eyes can only perceive a fraction of his true form. When he speaks, the sound comes from far above, like thunder learning to form words. He is calling to his brothers, and you understand the language though you have never heard it before. It resonates in your bones, in the spaces between your thoughts. He speaks of hunger, always, hunger, of the cattle they have already consumed, of the fields they have stripped bare, of their need for more, always more. You watch, paralyzed, as he reaches down and plucks a full-grown oak from the earth, as easily as you might pick a flower. He examines it with eyes that burn with intelligence, far exceeding any human's, then crushes it in his fist, letting the splinters fall like rain. The casual destruction speaks of boredom, of a being with power but no purpose, strength but no satisfaction. Behind him come others, a group of young Nephilim, each one unique in their monstrosity. One has skin that seems to be made of stone, another radiates heat that withers plants in a circle around him. A female among them sings as she walks, and her voice causes milk to sour, pregnant animals to miscarry, children to wake screaming from nightmares they cannot remember. They move through your world like titans through a dollhouse, acknowledging human existence only when it inconveniences them. The devoured earth. Within a generation of their birth, the Nephilim had transformed the antediluvian world into a landscape of desolation. What had begun as localized disruption around their birthplaces spread like a plague across the earth as they multiplied and migrated, seeking resources to sustain their impossible existence. The agricultural systems that humans had developed over centuries collapsed almost immediately. A single Nephilim could consume an entire harvest in a day, leaving nothing for seed or storage. They hunted animals to extinction in region after region, their supernatural senses allowing them to track prey that tried to hide, their speed enabling them to run down creatures that had always escaped human hunters. The great herds of cattle and sheep that had been humanity's wealth disappeared into the bottomless appetite of the giants. But mere food was not enough. The Nephilim inherited from their Watcher fathers a hunger for experience, for sensation, for dominance. They demanded not just sustenance, but tribute, not just food, but feast. Human communities were forced to offer their best of everything, the first fruits of harvest, the choicest animals, the most beautiful crafts. The giants developed tastes for specific delicacies and would destroy entire settlements that failed to provide them. The Book of Jubilees records the progression of horror, and they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. This was not mere predation, but something far worse. The Nephilim discovered that the life force contained in blood provided them with more than physical sustenance. It temporarily eased the constant tension of their dual nature, the pain of being creatures that belonged fully to neither heaven nor earth. When animal blood proved insufficient, they turned to humans. At first, they took only criminals or enemies, justifying their actions as a form of justice. But the line, once crossed, could not be re-established. The consumption of human flesh and blood became increasingly common, then systematic. Some of the Nephilim developed preferences for certain types of victims: children for their innocence, warriors for their strength, pregnant women for the potential life they carried. The corruption spread beyond physical consumption. The Nephilim, possessing knowledge inherited from their angelic fathers, but none of the moral restraints, began to experiment with the boundaries of life and death. They created hybrid abominations, mixing the essence of different creatures to produce new forms of life that nature never intended. The texts speak of beings with the bodies of horses and the heads of men, creatures with wings of eagles and the temperaments of wolves, monsters that could only exist through the perverted application of celestial knowledge to earthly matter. They also corrupted human society through more subtle means. Understanding the power structures of human communities, they set themselves up as gods, demanding worship and sacrifice. They took human women as their fathers had. Though not for love or even lust, but for the pleasure of domination, they forced humans to fight each other for their entertainment, creating the first gladiatorial contests, where communities were required to offer their strongest warriors to die for the amusement of the giants. The knowledge that the Watchers had taught to humanity was weaponized by their offspring. The metallurgy that Azazel had revealed was used to create weapons scaled for giant hands, clubs, and swords that could level buildings with a single swing. The magic that Semyaza had taught became a tool of oppression, with the Nephilim using enchantments to control human minds, to create illusions that drove people to madness, to curse bloodlines for perceived offences. Languages itself became corrupted. The Nephilim spoke in tongues that combined angelic and human speech, creating words that could command obedience, instill terror, or break the will. Humans who heard these words often lost the ability to speak their own languages properly, becoming unable to communicate, except in screams or whispers. The unified language that humanity had shared since Eden fragmented under the influence of giant speech, contributing to the divisions that would later be formalized at the Tower of Babel. Semyaza's regret. In the highest tower of the Nephilim city of Ardos, Semyaza sat alone, his perfect angelic form now permanently anchored to physical reality. The leader of the Watchers had gained what he thought he desired: a wife from among the daughters of men, children that combined his celestial nature with earthly form. But the reality proved to be a curse beyond his darkest expectations. His beloved, the woman for whom he had sacrificed his position in heaven, aged while he remained unchanged. He watched wrinkles form around eyes that had once captivated him, saw silver streak through hair he had compared to night itself. She grew afraid of him, this being who never tired, never hungered, never changed. Their love, if it could ever have been called that, withered like fruit left too long in the sunday. His children, the mighty Nephilim born from their union, were strangers to him. He had expected them to be bridges between the celestial and terrestrial, beings who could unite heaven and earth in harmony. Instead, they were cracks in reality itself, their very existence a wound that would not heal. When he looked at them, with his angelic perception, he saw not the glory he had anticipated, but distortion, like reflections in broken glass. One night, his eldest son came to him covered in blood that was not his own. The giant stood taller than the tower's ceiling, forcing him to crouch in his father's presence. His eyes held intelligence but no light, understanding but no wisdom. He spoke of the humans he had consumed, describing their terror as if it were wine, their dying screams as music. He asked his father to teach him more of the celestial arts, not for knowledge itself, but for the power it would bring. Semyaza realized then the full magnitude of his error. He had not brought heaven to earth, but had corrupted both. The oath on Mount Hermon bound him, preventing return to his celestial station, even had he desired it. He was trapped in a world that was dying because of his choices, watching his children accelerate its destruction. The other watchers looked to him for leadership, but he had no solutions, no wisdom that could undo what had been done. Blood cries from the ground. As the corruption deepened and spread across the face of the earth, creation itself began to rebel against the presence of the Nephilim. The natural order, established in the 7 days of creation and maintained by the faithful angels who had not fallen, groaned under the weight of violations too numerous to count. The blood of the innocent, spilled in quantities that turned rivers red and left whole valleys stained, did not simply soak into the earth and disappear. In the mystical understanding of the ancient world, blood carried the life force, the divine spark that animated all living beings. When shed in violence, especially innocent blood, it cried out for justice. The earth, which had been cursed to drink Abel's blood when Cain committed the first murder, now was drowning in an ocean of innocent life, deliberately destroyed. Plants began to wither in places where the Nephilim had fed, as if the very soil rejected their presence. Springs that had run pure for generations suddenly produced water that tasted of copper and salt. Animals gave birth to deformed offspring, or none at all. The seasons themselves became erratic, with snow falling in summer and crops sprouting in winter, only to die before they could be harvested. The sky reflected the earth's distress. Stars appeared to flicker and move from their appointed courses. The moon sometimes showed a face of blood, other times disappeared entirely, even when it should have been full. During the day, the sun would occasionally dim without clouds to obscure it, as if creation's source of light were averting its gaze from the horrors below. These signs terrified humans and Nephilim alike, for they suggested that the fundamental structures holding reality together were beginning to fail. The Council of Archangels. In the highest heaven, in the direct presence of the divine throne, 4 great archangels stood before the Ancient of Days. Michael, the warrior, whose name meant, "Who is like God?" Gabriel, the herald, whose name meant, "Strength of God." Raphael, the healer, whose name meant, "God heals." And Uriel, the flame of God, who held dominion over thunder and terror. They had witnessed the corruption spreading across the earth, had heard the cries of the innocent, rising like smoke from a sacrifice that should never have been offered. Now they presented their observations to the one who sees all, knows all, yet chooses to work through intermediaries to accomplish his will in the created order. Michael spoke first, his voice resonating with barely controlled rage. "Lord, you see what Semyaza and his companions have done. They have abandoned their station, revealed secrets that were hidden since the foundation of the world, and their children devour your creation like locusts. The earth is filled with violence through them. How long will you allow this rebellion to continue?" Gabriel added his testimony. "The prayer of the righteous reaches us day and night. Those humans who still remember your ways cry out for deliverance. They are hunted like animals, enslaved, consumed. Their faith wavers as they see the wicked prosper and the innocent perish. Some have begun to worship the Nephilim as gods, not from devotion but from terror." Raphael, whose nature was to heal and restore, spoke of the damage to creation itself. "The boundaries you established are breaking down. The separation between the waters above and below grows thin. The gates between dimensions that should remain closed are being forced open by the hybrid nature of the Nephilim. If this continues, creation itself will collapse back into the primordial chaos from which you called it forth." Uriel, keeper of mysteries and guardian of divine terror, spoke last. The watchers knew the consequences of their actions. They swore their oath with full understanding, binding themselves with curses. They have taught humanity to sin in ways that humans could never have discovered on their own. Through them, evil has taken forms that will echo through all generations, even after the watchers themselves are bound. The divine response came not in words, but in understanding that filled the archangels simultaneously. They were given their missions, each according to his nature, and the requirements of justice tempered with mercy. The corruption would be cleansed, but not without warning, not without opportunity for repentance, not without preserving a remnant through which creation could begin again. Michael received orders to bind Semyaza and his companions, to imprison them in darkness until the day of final judgment, but not immediately. First, they would witness the destruction of everything they had built, everyone they had corrupted or created. They would see their children, the mighty Nephilim, turn on each other in cannibalistic fury. Only when they had experienced the full fruit of their rebellion would they be cast into the abyss. Gabriel was sent to destroy the Nephilim, but through their own nature, rather than direct divine intervention. He would inspire them to war against each other, to turn their immense strength and hunger inward until they consumed themselves. The giants who had terrorized humanity would become their own executioners, their violence ultimately self-defeating. Raphael received a special mission concerning Azazel, the one whom the text held most responsible for Earth's corruption. He would be bound hand and foot, cast into an opening in the desert of Judaism, covered with rough stones and darkness. Over him would be written all the sins of the world, making him the eternal scapegoat, the one who bore responsibility for teaching humanity to destroy itself. Uriel was sent to Noah, the one righteous man in his generation, to warn him of the coming deluge and instruct him in the building of the ark. Through Noah, a bridge would be preserved between the world that was ending and the world that would be renewed. The knowledge of what had happened would be maintained, a warning to future generations about the consequences of breaking the boundaries that God had established. Enoch, the scribe. Among all humans living in that corrupted age, one man walked between the worlds with divine approval. Enoch, the seventh generation from Adam, had lived 365 years, a perfect solar cycle, in such close communion with the divine that the boundaries between human and heavenly became permeable for him alone. Enoch was not a warrior like the mighty hunters of his age, nor was he wealthy in the manner of those who had learned to exploit others for gain. He was a scribe, one who observed and recorded, who preserved knowledge for future generations. But his writing was not merely human documentation. He had been chosen to witness and record the cosmic drama unfolding between heaven and earth, to serve as a notary for divine judgment. The Book of Enoch describes how he was taken up in visions to see the throne of glory, the cosmic geography of heaven and hell, the places prepared for different categories of souls after death. He saw the tree of life, whose fruit would one day heal the nations. He saw the abyss prepared for the rebellious angels, the mountains that held the chambers of the dead, the sources of all the waters of the earth. But his most significant role came when the Watchers, realizing that judgment was approaching, sought him out as an intermediary. They knew that their own prayers could no longer reach heaven, that the oath they had sworn on Mount Hermon had severed their direct connection to the divine throne. But Enoch, though human, had access they had lost. They begged him to write a petition on their behalf, to seek forgiveness for their transgression, to plead for mercy for themselves and their children. Enoch agreed to carry their message, not from sympathy, but from his role as cosmic witness. He wrote down their words, their acknowledgement of sin, their plea for forgiveness. He took their petition to the waters of Dan, in the land that would later be called Israel, and read it repeatedly until he fell asleep. In his sleep, visions came to him, terrible visions that contained the divine response to the Watchers' plea. The forgiveness they sought would not be granted. Their sin was not one of momentary weakness, but of deliberate, calculated rebellion. They had possessed full knowledge of the consequences of their actions, and had chosen to proceed anyway. They had corrupted not just themselves, but an entire world, had introduced evils that would persist throughout human history. For this, there could be no simple absolution. The vision revealed to Enoch the full extent of the Watchers' punishment. They would be bound in the valleys of the earth until the great day of judgment, imprisoned in darkness where they would remain fully conscious, but unable to act, unable to die, unable to repent effectively. Their children, the Nephilim, would be destroyed, and from their destruction would come evil spirits that would plague humanity until the end of days. The Watchers would be forced to watch the complete annihilation of everything they had tried to build. But Enoch's role went beyond carrying messages. He was commanded to proclaim judgment directly to the Watchers. to speak with divine authority to beings that had once stood in the presence of the throne of glory. A human, made from dust, would pronounce sentence on angels who had sung at creation's dawn. This reversal emphasized the magnitude of their fall, that they had descended so far that even a mortal could stand in judgment over them. Enoch also received revelations about the future, about times when the events he was witnessing would be remembered and understood. He saw the coming of the flood that would cleanse the earth, but also times beyond that when evil would again multiply, when humanity would again reach for powers beyond their rightful grasp. He wrote these visions in books, multiple books, knowing that most would be lost or hidden, but trusting that enough would survive to warn future generations. His writings became the first apocalyptic literature, establishing patterns that would be echoed in Daniel, in Ezekiel, in the Revelation of John. The structure of heaven and hell that he described would influence Jewish, Christian, and Islamic understanding of the afterlife. The notion of fallen angels as a source of evil in the world would become a fundamental explanation for the presence of suffering in a universe created by a benevolent God. Walking between worlds. You are Enoch, and you stand at the threshold between realities, your mortal flesh trembling with the effort of containing revelations meant for eternal beings. The ground beneath your feet feels less solid than it should, as if you might at any moment fall through it into the abyss you have seen in visions. Above you, the sky ripples like water, and through the ripples you glimpse the mechanisms of heaven, the wheels within wheels that govern the movements of stars and the fate of souls. The Watchers have summoned you to their presence, these mighty beings who once stood before the throne of the Most High. As you approach their dwelling place, you feel the corruption in the air itself, a wrongness that makes your skin crawl and your spirit recoil. They have built a palace of black stone that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, each brick inscribed with symbols that hurt to perceive directly. Semyaza receives you in what was once a throne room, but now feels more like a tomb. His beauty remains, but it is the beauty of a statue, perfect in form, but lacking the animating breath of divine approval. When he speaks, his voice carries harmonics that human ears were never meant to hear, and you must concentrate to extract meaning from the sound. Scribe of righteousness, he says, and the title burns on your skin like a brand. You who walk with the Most High, carry our words to the throne we can no longer approach. We have sinned, we acknowledge this. We have corrupted, we have destroyed. We have taught what should have remained hidden, but surely the mercy that extends to all creation extends also to us. You write his words, your hand moving of its own accord, the letters forming in a script that shifts between human writing and celestial notation. As you write, you see not just the present moment but its causes and consequences, the threads of action and reaction that connect this petition to the cosmic order. You see the tears of the women they seduced, now aged and abandoned. You see the blood of the innocents their children have devoured. You see the knowledge they revealed being used for war, for oppression, for blasphemies that will echo through millennia. The petition of the damned. The document Enoch carried was unlike any text that had been written before. The Watchers, in their desperation, had composed a legal brief for the court of heaven, attempting to use the very structures of divine justice to argue for their forgiveness. They began with acknowledgement of their crime, hoping that confession might mitigate judgment. We have sinned, we have transgressed, we have done evil in your sight, they declared through Enoch's pen. They listed their crimes in detail, abandoning their posts, revealing celestial secrets, taking wives from among humanity, fathering the Nephilim who corrupted the earth. They held nothing back, perhaps hoping that complete honesty might earn them some measure of mercy. But then came their arguments for clemency. They pointed out that they had been created as observers, given the capacity to perceive beauty and feel attraction. Was it not the Creator who had made them capable of the very desires that led to their fall? They argued that their crime was one of love, not hatred, that they had sought union, not destruction. The corruption that followed was an unintended consequence, not their original purpose. They invoked the mercy that had been shown to humanity after the fall in Eden, Adam and Eve had directly disobeyed a divine command, yet they were not immediately destroyed. They were punished, yes, exiled from paradise, but they were allowed to live, to procreate, to begin again. Could not the same mercy be extended to the Watchers who had fallen not through direct disobedience to a specific command, but through a desire that overwhelmed their judgment? They even attempted to bargain, offering to return to heaven if their children could be spared, or to accept imprisonment if the Nephilim could be reformed rather than destroyed. They proposed various compromises, each more desperate than the last. The negotiations of beings who knew their position was hopeless but could not accept their fate. Dreams of judgment. In the waters of Dan, Enoch read the petition until exhaustion overtook him. As sleep claimed his mortal form, his spirit was caught up in visions that revealed the divine response to the Watcher's plea. The dream was more real than waking, each image carved into his consciousness with terrible clarity. He saw a house built of white stone, with walls like tessellated marble and floors of crystal. Within this house was another house, larger than the first, though contained within it, built entirely of flames that were somehow also ice. The paradox did not trouble his dream consciousness, which understood that he was seeing spiritual realities for which physical description was only metaphor. Upon a throne that was itself a sun sat the Ancient of Days, whose appearance Enoch could not describe even in vision, for to look directly upon him was to lose all sense of self, to be absorbed into a light that was also darkness, a presence that was also absence. From this throne came a voice that spoke without words, communication that bypassed language to inscribe itself directly onto the tablets of the heart. The judgment was absolute. There would be no forgiveness for the Watchers in this age. They would watch their children destroy each other. They would be bound in the valleys of the earth for 70 generations. At the final judgment, they would be cast into the lake of fire, prepared for all rebels against the divine order. Their names would be erased from the books of heaven. Their legacy would be one of warning, not glory. The Valley of Eternal Fire. In his vision, Enoch was shown the place prepared for the ultimate punishment of the Watchers. It was a valley beyond the physical world yet connected to it, a space that existed in the overlap between dimensions. The walls of this valley were not made of rock but of compressed darkness, shadows that had taken solid form. The floor was covered with stones that radiated cold, that burned worse than any flame. In the center of this valley was a fire that provided no light, only heat that consumed without destroying. The flames moved like living things, reaching out with tentacles of pure pain to embrace anything that came near. This was not ordinary fire that turned matter to ash, but something that burned the very essence of being, that could torture spirits who had no physical form to destroy. Here the Watchers would be brought after witnessing the destruction of their children and the cleansing of the earth. Here they would remain until the end of days, fully conscious, fully aware of what they had lost, unable to die or escape or even go mad from the torment. The fire would burn away everything except awareness and regret, leaving them as hollow spirits, capable only of remembering what they once were. Around this valley of punishment were other valleys, each designed for different categories of sinners. Enoch saw the places reserved for those who blasphemed, for those who oppressed the righteous, for those who accumulated wealth through violence. But the deepest valley, the one from which no sound escaped because the suffering was too profound for expression, was reserved for the Watchers who had known the glory of heaven and chosen to trade it for corruption. The angel guiding Enoch through this vision explained that the severity of the punishment reflected the magnitude of the crime. Humans who sinned did so in ignorance, driven by passions they did not fully understand, making choices whose consequences they could not foresee. But the Watchers had possessed complete knowledge. They had stood in the presence of ultimate truth and beauty, and consciously chose to turn away from it. Their punishment was not vindictive but necessary, a re-establishment of the cosmic order they had violated. When heaven wept. As news of the judgment spread through the celestial realms, those angels who had remained faithful to their posts responded with grief that shook the foundations of heaven itself. These were not tears of water, but of liquid light that fell through the dimensions, appearing on earth as meteor showers that terrified the humans who witnessed them. The faithful angels had loved their fallen brothers, had shared with them the joy of creation's dawn, had sung together in the cosmic chorus that celebrated each new star's birth. Now they must accept that 200 of their number were lost forever, that voices which had once harmonized with theirs would be silenced or transformed into screams of eternal regret. Some of the angels petitioned to be allowed to take the Watchers' places on earth, to try to undo the damage that had been done. But this was forbidden. The boundary between heaven and earth had been violated once. It would not be permitted again. The faithful must remain at their posts, maintaining the cosmic order while creation healed from the wounds the Watchers had inflicted. In their grief, the angels composed lamentations that would later be echoed in human psalms and prophecies. They sang of the beauty that was lost, the potential that would never be fulfilled, the empty places in heaven's hierarchy that would remain vacant until the end of time. Their songs carried warnings to all created beings about the price of rebellion, the cost of choosing personal desire over divine purpose. The sons of Seth. Not all ancient traditions accepted the angelic interpretation of the Nephilim's origin. Some Hebrew texts, uncomfortable with the idea of angels capable of physical reproduction, proposed an alternative reading of the Genesis account. In this interpretation, the sons of God were not celestial beings but the descendants of Seth, Adam's third son, who had maintained religious purity. The daughters of men were the descendants of Cain, who had built the first cities and developed human culture apart from divine guidance. This reading suggested that the corruption came not from cosmic rebellion, but from the mixing of spiritual and worldly bloodlines. The Sethites, who had preserved the knowledge of God and maintained ritual purity, were seduced by the beauty and sophistication of the Cainite women. The union produced offspring who combined religious knowledge with worldly ambition, creating a toxic mixture that corrupted both lines. The giants in this interpretation were not physical giants, but moral and spiritual monsters, humans whose pride and ambition grew to gigantic proportions. They were men of renown, famous for their achievements, but infamous for their cruelty. They built the first empires, established the first systematic oppression, created the first totalitarian states, where human will was completely subordinated to the whims of the powerful. This naturalistic reading preserved the essential truth of the narrative, while avoiding the theological complications of breeding angels. It suggested that human beings were capable of producing their own monsters without supernatural intervention, that the mixing of spiritual knowledge with unchecked ambition could produce evils as great as any attributed to fallen angels. Yet even this interpretation could not fully explain the cosmic scope of the judgment that followed. If the Nephilim were merely proud humans, why did their existence threaten the very fabric of creation? Why did their presence require not just human justice, but divine intervention on a scale that would reshape the entire world? The naturalistic reading, while solving some problems, created others that could only be resolved by returning to the supernatural understanding that beings from another order of existence had invaded the human sphere. Spirits of the Nephilim. The death of the Nephilim did not end their influence on the world. According to the Book of Enoch and other ancient texts, when these hybrid beings died, their spirits could not follow the normal path of human souls, nor could they return to the celestial realm from which half their nature derived. They became something new and terrible. Demons, evil spirits trapped between dimensions, neither fully material nor completely spiritual. These spirits of the Nephilim retained the consciousness and desires of their physical existence, but lacked bodies through which to satisfy them. They hungered but could not eat, thirsted but could not drink, lusted but could not touch. This perpetual frustration drove them to seek vicarious satisfaction through human beings influencing mortals to commit the sins they could no longer perform directly. The text describes how these spirits would plague humanity throughout history, teaching war and violence to new generations, inspiring the creation of idols that demanded blood sacrifice, whispering formulas for poison and techniques of torture to those whose hearts were open to such influence. They became the invisible architects of human suffering, working to recreate the corruption that had existed before the flood. But their power was limited. Unlike their fathers, the Watchers, who had possessed direct authority over aspects of creation, the Nephilim spirits could only influence, not command. They needed human cooperation to accomplish their goals, required weakness or wickedness in human hearts to gain entry. They could tempt but not force, suggest but not compel. Their greatest weapon was deception, making evil appear good, making destruction seem like creation, making slavery feel like freedom. This understanding of demonic origin would profoundly influence Jewish and Christian demonology. It explained why evil spirits seemed to have knowledge beyond human understanding, why they could predict future events or reveal hidden secrets. They retained fragments of the celestial knowledge their fathers had possessed, distorted and corrupted but still powerful. It also explained their particular hatred for humanity, their desire to drag humans down to share in their own damnation. Waters above and below. The flood that would cleanse the earth of the Nephilim's corruption was not merely rain, not simply water falling from the sky for 40 days and 40 nights. The texts speak of something far more cosmic, the undoing of creation itself, the reversal of the separations that had been established in the beginning when the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. In the Genesis account of creation, God had separated the waters above from the waters below, creating a space between them where life could flourish. The firmament, that mysterious barrier between dimensions, held back primordial waters that existed before light, before land, before life. Now, as the corruption of the Watchers and their offspring reached its apex, those barriers would be deliberately breached. The windows of heaven would open, and the fountains of the great deep would break forth, reuniting waters that had been divided since the second day of creation. Noah, warned by Uriel according to the Book of Enoch, or by God directly according to Genesis, understood that this was not simply a natural disaster, but a cosmic reset. The ark he was commanded to build was not just a boat, but a sealed container that would preserve a remnant of creation, while everything else returned to primordial chaos. The specific instructions for its construction, detailed down to the type of wood and the placement of the window, suggested that it needed to withstand forces beyond normal comprehension. The gopher wood specified for the ark's construction was not ordinary timber, but something unique to that antediluvian world, perhaps trees that had grown in soil, enriched by the proximity of paradise, retaining properties that later vegetation would lack. The pitch that sealed it inside and out created a barrier not just against water, but against the spiritual corruption that had infected the earth. The ark became a bubble of the original creation, a seed from which the world could be replanted. As the day of judgment approached, the Nephilim began to sense their doom. Their hybrid perception, which allowed them to see into spiritual dimensions, revealed the gathering of forces beyond the physical. They saw angels taking positions, reality itself preparing to unmake and remake itself. Some tried to build their own vessels of survival, massive constructs that could hold their gigantic forms. But they failed to understand that the coming flood was not just physical, but metaphysical, designed specifically to eliminate beings that should never have existed. The Book of Enoch describes how the giants turned on each other in the days before the flood, driven to cannibalistic fury by the spirit of destruction that Gabriel had been sent to inspire among them. Their great cities became battlegrounds where brother consumed brother, where the mighty strength they had used to oppress humanity became the instrument of their own annihilation. The earth drank giant blood, as it had drunk human blood, but this time it was a cleansing rather than a corruption. When the rain began, it was gentle at first, almost a mist, as if creation was sighing before the violent work of purgation. But then the windows of heaven truly opened, and water fell in sheets so thick that breathing became difficult. The fountains of the deep erupted with waters that had been pressurized since the foundation of the world, geysers that reached toward the descending rain, reuniting in a brace that crushed everything between them. The Watchers, bound now by Michael's angels, were forced to watch their children die. The Nephilim, for all their strength and size, could not swim in waters that were more than physical. The flood carried with it the authority of divine judgment, and against that, no amount of gigantic strength could prevail. They drowned not just in water, but in the dissolution of the reality that had allowed them to exist. Their bodies, those impossible combinations of angelic and human nature, came apart at the fundamental level, releasing the spirits that would become the demons of later ages. For 150 days, the waters prevailed upon the earth. Every mountain was covered, every valley filled. The planet became again what it had been before the second day of creation. A world of waters without form or void, darkness upon the face of the deep. But within the ark, sealed and floating upon this cosmic ocean, life waited. Noah and his family, the animals 2 by 2 or 7 by 7, the seeds and sprouts of a new world, rested in the darkness, hearing the rain on the roof, like a lullaby of judgment and mercy combined. When finally the waters receded, they did so slowly, reluctantly, as if the earth were hesitant to emerge again into a reality where such corruption might once more take root. The mountains appeared first, like the world being born again, then the valleys, then the plains. When Noah finally emerged from the ark, he stepped onto soil that had been washed clean, purified by the most thorough cleansing the world would ever know. But the memory remained. In the layers of sediment that the flood deposited, in the fossils of creatures that had lived in that lost world, in the stories that every culture would tell about the time when water covered everything. And most significantly, in the texts that preserved the true story of why the flood had come. Not just human wickedness, but the cosmic rebellion of the Watchers and the monstrous offspring they had created. Under desert stars. You are a Bedouin shepherd in the year 1947, though you don't think of it that way. To you, this is simply another day in the Judean desert, searching for a goat that has wandered from the flock. The sun is setting, painting the limestone cliffs in shades of gold and shadow. The caves that pocket these cliffs have been used by shepherds for thousands of years, places to shelter from sudden storms, to rest during the heat of the day. The goat's tracks lead up a steep path to a cave entrance you've never noticed before, partially hidden by a fall of rocks. You throw a stone into the darkness, expecting to hear it clatter against the cave floor. Instead, there's a sound like pottery breaking, ceramic shattering in the darkness. Curious now, you squeeze through the entrance, your eyes slowly adjusting to the dimness within. The cave is larger than you expected, and along one wall stand tall clay jars, ancient vessels, sealed with lids and covered in dust that might have been accumulating since before the Romans came to these lands. Your hands, rough from years of handling sheep and goats, carefully lift one of the lids. Inside, wrapped in linen that crumbles at your touch, are scrolls, rolls of leather, and papyrus covered in writing you cannot read. You don't know it yet, but you have just discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, and among them are fragments of the Book of Enoch, the Book of Giants, texts that preserve the story of the Watchers in languages that were old when Jesus walked these same desert paths. These scrolls were hidden here by the Essenes, a Jewish sect that believed the end times were approaching, that the war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness was about to begin. The Essenes, who copied these texts by lamplight in their scriptorium at Qumran, were obsessed with the Watchers. They saw in that ancient fall a template for understanding their own time, when foreign powers occupied their land and the temple in Jerusalem had become, in their view, corrupted. They believed that just as the Watchers had brought forbidden knowledge to humanity, so too were their evil spirits in their own age, teaching people to abandon the true faith. As you hold these scrolls, feeling their weight and age, the stars begin to appear in the desert sky above. These are the same stars the Watchers once governed, the same constellations that Kokhabiel taught humans to read for signs and portents. But now they are just lights in the darkness, beautiful but distant, no longer the home of beings who might descend to walk among us. The Ethiopian memory, far to the south, across the Red Sea, and deep into the mountains of Africa, The Ethiopian Orthodox Church had been preserving its own version of this story for over a millennium. In monasteries carved from solid rock, in churches that claimed to house the Ark of the Covenant itself, monks had been copying and recopying the Book of Enoch in Ge'ez, the ancient language of Ethiopian liturgy. To the Ethiopian Christians, Enoch was not an apocryphal figure, but a prophet as important as Isaiah or Jeremiah. They called the book Mashafar Henoch and read from it during their religious services, particularly during the season they called Tzom Nebiat, the fast of the prophets. Every priest knew the story of the Watchers. Every child heard tales of the giants who had once walked the earth. The Ethiopian tradition preserved details that had been lost elsewhere. They maintained that the mountain where the Watchers descended was in their own land, that Mount Hermon was actually a peak in the Ethiopian highlands. They claimed that some of the Nephilim had fled to Africa before the flood, that the massive stone monuments found across the continent were remnants of giant architecture. These claims couldn't be verified archaeologically, but they spoke to how deeply the story had rooted itself in Ethiopian consciousness. In the rock churches of Lalibela, carved below ground level in the 12th century, pilgrims could see representations of the Watchers' fall painted on the walls. The artists depicted them not as European angels with white wings, but as beings of terrifying beauty with features that reflected the diversity of creation itself. Some had skin like polished obsidian, others like bronze, still others like ivory, but all shared the same expression of tragic loss, the same downward gaze that spoke of paradise forsaken. The Ethiopian monks also preserved traditions about what happened to the books that Enoch wrote. They claimed that Noah had carried them onto the ark, that they had been passed down through Shem to Abraham to Moses, who had hidden them in the place where the Ark of the Covenant was constructed. When the Queen of Sheba visited Solomon, she had received these texts as part of the wisdom he shared with her, and she had brought them back to Ethiopia, where they had been preserved ever since. Whether historically accurate or not, these traditions ensured that the Book of Enoch survived when it might otherwise have been lost. The Ethiopian Church's isolation from both Eastern and Western Christianity, combined with its deep reverence for ancient texts, created a perfect preservation environment. When European scholars finally gained access to these texts in the modern era, they found that the Ethiopian version matched remarkably well with the fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, suggesting a careful tradition of transmission stretching back over 2 millennia. Echoes in Babylon. The story of divine beings descending to earth and producing hybrid offspring was not unique to the Hebrew tradition. In the libraries of Ashurbanipal, on tablets of clay, written in cuneiform, archaeologists found remarkably similar narratives from ancient Mesopotamia that predated the biblical account by centuries. The Mesopotamian Apkallu were 7 sages who emerged from the waters in the time before the flood, beings who were part man and part fish, sent by the god Ea to teach humanity the arts of civilization. Like the Watchers, they brought knowledge that transformed human society: writing, law, temple building, agriculture, mathematics. Like the Watchers, their presence on earth was temporary, ended by a great flood that wiped away the first age of the world. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, that oldest of human literature, the hero himself was described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a giant of great strength whose hybrid nature brought both power and tragedy. His companion, Enkidu, was created by the gods as a wild man who had to be civilized through sacred prostitution, echoing themes of divine beings corrupted through sexuality. The flood narrative in Gilgamesh, with its hero Utnapishtim building an ark to survive divine judgment, provided another parallel to the biblical story. The Sumerian king list spoke of rulers before the flood, who reigned for thousands of years, whose lifespans were so extreme that they could only be explained by non-human heritage. After the flood, the text states, kingship descended from heaven again, but the lifespans were dramatically reduced, as if the divine element in human bloodlines had been diluted or removed entirely. Even in Greek mythology, far from the Semitic world, similar themes appeared. The Titans, the old gods who had ruled before Zeus and the Olympians, were imprisoned in Tartarus after their rebellion, bound in darkness, much like the Watchers in Enoch's vision. The heroes of Greek legend, demigods like Heracles and Perseus, were offspring of unions between gods and mortals, possessed of great strength but doomed to tragedy. Greek Titans, Hindu Asuras. The pattern of divine rebellion and imprisonment appeared across cultures with such consistency that it suggested either a common origin or a fundamental human understanding of cosmic order and its violation. The Greek Titans, those primordial deities who ruled during the Golden Age, bore striking resemblances to the Watchers. They were not evil in their origin, but became corrupted through power and desire. Kronos, who devoured his own children to prevent them from usurping his throne, echoed the cannibalistic Nephilim. The Titanomachy, the 10-year war between the Titans and the Olympians, paralleled the conflict between the faithful angels and the fallen ones. The final imprisonment of the Titans in Tartarus, a place of darkness below the underworld, matched the abyss where the Watchers were confined. In Hindu cosmology, the Asuras were divine beings who opposed the Devas, not originally evil, but driven by passion, pride, and desire for power. Like the Watchers, they possessed great knowledge and abilities. Like the Nephilim, they could be gigantic in size and terrible in aspect. The constant warfare between Asuras and Devas, with humans caught in between, reflected the same cosmic conflict that the Book of Enoch described. The Hindu text Bhagavata Purana told of Daityas and Danavas, races of giants born from inappropriate unions, who had to be destroyed by divine intervention when their power threatened the cosmic order. The concept of the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and corruption that precedes cosmic renewal, paralleled the antediluvian period when the Nephilim corrupted the earth. These cross-cultural parallels suggested that the story of the Watchers touched something deep in human consciousness, a memory or understanding that transcended specific religious traditions. Whether these were independent inventions, cultural transmissions, or memories of actual events preserved in mythological form, remained a matter of debate among scholars. The Qumran fragments. The caves at Qumran yielded more than just the Book of Enoch. Among the thousands of fragments, scholars pieced together texts that had been completely unknown to the modern world, including the Book of Giants, which told the story of the Nephilim from their own perspective. These fragments, some no larger than postage stamps, had to be assembled like the world's most complex jigsaw puzzle. Written in Aramaic, the language Jesus would have spoken, they preserved names and narratives that expanded the Watcher mythology. The giants were given individual identities: Oya and Hahya, the sons of Semyaza; Marwe, who experienced prophetic dreams; Barakel, whose name meant lightning of God. The Book of Giants described the nightmares that plagued the Nephilim as divine judgment approached. They dreamed of trees being uprooted, of gardens being destroyed, of tablets being washed clean. These dreams were interpreted by Enoch, who served as an intermediary, even for the monsters, explaining that they represented the coming flood that would erase them from existence. One fragment described a journey that two of the giants made to seek Enoch's interpretation of their dreams. They travelled to the ends of the earth, one flying with wings that had been inherited from his angelic father, the other running with speed that devoured distances. This detail suggested that not all the Nephilim were identical, that their hybrid nature expressed itself in different ways, depending on which Watcher had fathered them. The Qumran community that preserved these texts saw themselves as spiritual warriors in a battle that had begun with the Watcher's fall. They believed that the same evil spirits that had emerged from the dying Nephilim were still active in their own time, influencing the Romans, corrupting the temple priesthood, preparing for a final battle between light and darkness. Their community rule, another text found in the caves, prescribed ritual purifications and spiritual practices designed to protect against the influence of these evil spirits. They practiced celibacy, not from a hatred of the body, but from a fear of repeating the Watcher's sin. They studied the movements of the stars, not for divination, but to understand the cosmic order that the Watchers had violated. Modern Nephilim hunters. In the centuries since the Enlightenment, as myth and history became increasingly separated in academic thought, the story of the Watchers and Nephilim moved from theology to archaeology, from faith to speculation. Yet the search for physical evidence of giants has never entirely ceased. Across the internet age, images circulate of allegedly gigantic skeletons discovered in various archaeological sites. A photograph from the 1890s shows men standing next to a skeleton that appears to be 12 feet tall. Reports from early American newspapers describe giant bones found in Native American mounds. The Smithsonian Institution has been accused of hiding evidence of giant remains to preserve the conventional understanding of human history. Most of these claims dissolve under scrutiny. The photographs prove to be manipulated, the newspaper accounts exaggerated or fictional, the conspiracy theories unsupported by evidence. Yet the persistence of these searches speaks to something deeper than mere curiosity. There remains a human need to find physical proof of the mythological, to validate ancient stories through modern science. More serious scholars have looked for evidence of the Watchers and Nephilim in other ways. They study ancient megalithic structures, wondering how primitive peoples could have moved stones weighing hundreds of tons. They analyze myths of giants from around the world, looking for common elements that might point to shared experiences. They examine fossil records for evidence of unusually large human remains, though none have been found that exceed the known range of human gigantism. Some researchers have proposed that the Nephilim stories preserve memories of Neanderthal Homo sapiens interactions, that the giants were simply a different human species that seemed monstrous to our ancestors. Others suggest that the tales remember a ruling class that used their knowledge and resources to seem godlike to primitive peoples, building monuments and wielding technologies that appeared magical. Digital demons. In our modern age, the Watchers and their offspring have found new life in popular culture, transformed from theological warnings into entertainment properties. Video games feature Nephilim as boss battles. Television series reimagine them as misunderstood heroes. Novels romantically portray the love between angels and humans that led to cosmic catastrophe. This popularization has stripped away much of the terror and warning that the original stories contained. The Watchers become rebellious anti-heroes rather than cautionary examples. The Nephilim transform from world-destroying monsters into powerful beings struggling with their dual nature. The flood becomes just another apocalyptic event rather than divine judgment on cosmic corruption. Yet perhaps this cultural fascination reflects something deeper. In an age where genetic engineering promises to let us redesign our own species, where artificial intelligence might create beings superior to humans, where the boundaries between human and machine, natural and artificial, are increasingly blurred, the story of the Watchers resonates with new relevance. The warning about beings who possessed knowledge without wisdom, power without restraint, desire without discipline, speaks to contemporary anxieties about technological advancement. The Nephilim, hybrids who belonged fully to neither realm, mirror modern concerns about identity and belonging in an increasingly fluid world. Conspiracy theories about the Nephilim persist in darker corners of the internet. Some claim that their bloodlines survived the flood, that elite families carried giant DNA, that this explains their power and their alleged involvement in occult practices. Others believe that the Watchers will return, that UFO sightings are actually angelic beings preparing for another descent, that genetic manipulation is preparing human bodies to once again bear Nephilim offspring. These modern myths, while far from the theological sophistication of ancient texts, serve a similar function. They attempt to explain inequality, to understand evil, to make sense of a world that often seems controlled by forces beyond human comprehension or control. The Watchers and Nephilim become metaphors for whatever seems to threaten the established order, whatever appears to violate the boundaries of the acceptable and known. The watch continues. As we reach the end of this journey through ancient texts and modern interpretations, through floods that cleansed and corruptions that persisted, the story of the Watchers remains as relevant as it was 3,000 years ago. It speaks to fundamental questions that humanity has never fully answered. Why does evil exist in a world created by a benevolent deity? What are the boundaries that should not be crossed? What is the price of knowledge without wisdom? The Watchers themselves, if we accept the narrative of the ancient texts, remain imprisoned in darkness, bound until the final judgment. But their legacy persists in multiple forms. In the evil spirits that the dying Nephilim became, influences that teach humanity to destroy itself through war, pollution, and hatred. In the forbidden knowledge they revealed, technologies and techniques that can be used for good or evil depending on human choices. In the stories themselves, preserved across millennia as warnings about the consequences of transgression. Modern humanity stands at its own moment of watching. We observe the boundaries of nature and increasingly choose to cross them. We possess knowledge that previous generations would have considered divine, the ability to split atoms, to edit genes, to create artificial minds. Like the Watchers, we face the temptation to use our knowledge to transform the world according to our desires, rather than accepting our appointed place in the cosmic order. The antediluvian world that the Watchers corrupted was destroyed by water, washed clean, in a divine reset that allowed creation to begin again. But the texts are clear that this was a one-time event, that God promised never again to destroy the world by flood. The rainbow stands as a sign of that covenant, a boundary marker between the age of divine intervention and the age of human responsibility. Yet the story suggests that corruption can return, that boundaries can again be violated, that beings can again appear who combine different orders of existence in ways that threaten the fabric of reality. The difference is that now humanity has been warned. The preservation of the Watchers' story across cultures and millennia serves as a permanent reminder of what happens when power exceeds wisdom, when desire overcomes discipline, when the created attempt to become creators themselves. In the Ethiopian monasteries, monks still copy the Book of Enoch by hand, preserving the story for future generations. In academic institutions, scholars continue to translate and interpret the fragments from Qumran, uncovering new details about humanity's oldest nightmare. In popular culture, writers and artists reimagine the Watchers and Nephilim for contemporary audiences, keeping the symbols alive even as their meaning shifts. The watch continues. But now it is humanity that must serve as watchers, observing our own actions, guarding against our own tendency toward corruption. We are simultaneously the watched and the watchers, the potential victims, and the possible perpetrators of the next great transgression. The knowledge that destroyed the antediluvian world has become our inheritance, and with it comes the responsibility to use it wisely or risk consequences that no flood can wash away. As you drift towards sleep, consider the boundaries in your own life, the knowledge you possess, the power you wield, however small it might seem. Remember that the Watchers' fall began not with great evil but with simple desire, not with hatred but with attraction, not with the intention to destroy, but with the wish to possess. Guard your own watch carefully, for we are all capable of becoming either angels or monsters, preservers or corrupters, faithful guardians or fallen watchers of the reality we share. The ancient texts preserve one final detail that offers hope. Though the Watchers fell and the Nephilim corrupted the earth, though the flood destroyed the world that was, life continued. Noah and his family emerged from the ark to plant vineyards and build new cities. Humanity learned, slowly and imperfectly, to live with the knowledge the Watchers had revealed. Creation, wounded but not destroyed, continued its movement toward an end that even angels do not fully know. I'm grateful you've accompanied me through these historical landscapes tonight. Rest well beneath the starlit skies of ancient nights.